When the news of Gough's death was announced, there were many tributes immediately across the media. I think one of the most elegant, though, obituaries was penned by Race Mathews. A trusted staffer for many years, he took over the role as Gough Whitlam's private secretary from John Mathews in 1967. Please welcome Race Mathews.
A Representative Whitlam directive reads, "Those who were there have a duty to educate those who were not." His commitment was to equality for all. He believed the proper business of politics was to secure informed public consent for necessary change through objective input from trusted sources. His mantra was succinct: the party, the policy, the people. He gave back hope to my generation of Labor Party members. Chifley's light on the hill was rekindled. The party's electability was restored. His political career invites us to recall the words of the founder Fabian Bernard Shaw, as quoted famously by Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. "Some see things as they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and say, why not?" His provenance was plain. He epitomised throughout his career the Fabian approach to politics and policy development, as he was on one occasion heard to assert, "Among Australian Fabians, I am Maximus." Australians are accustomed to having their votes sought through their purses and pockets. Whitlam alone, in the memories of most of us, has addressed himself uncompromising to our consciences and intellects. He himself would not necessarily have regarded so sweepingly affirmative an assessment as inappropriate, as a characteristic flight of self-mockery attests. At a low point in his government's fortunes, his Senate colleague and then President of the Queensland Rugby League, Ron McAuliffe, invited him to launch the league's grand final. Walking to the centre of the ground, he and McAuliffe were greeted by a barrage of abuse and beer cans, which resumed following the ceremony. McAuliffe, Gough remonstrated as they returned to the pavilion, "Don't you ever again invite me somewhere where you're so unpopular." He was a giant, brought down finally by pygmies, not necessarily in all cases from the opposite side of politics, as resistance within the party to a long overdue reform and renewal denied him victory at the 1969 elections, and with it the opportunity to endow Australia with an enduring social democracy, as he had stated previously to a hostile 1967 Victorian State Conference, only the impotent are pure." I first met Whitlam following an address by him to a Fabian Society meeting shortly after his election as Deputy Leader of the Opposition in 1960. Leaving the venue, the Society's President, David Bennett, said to me that it was the best speech by a Labor leader he had ever heard. Any impression I may have made on him must have been minimal, since he later vetoed my pre-selection for the La Trobe electorate at the 1963 elections. He believed, was too young, and Moscas would make a better candidate. Subsequently, his then Principal Private Secretary, John Mathews, recruited David and me to advise on the preparation and presentation of education policy. A paper we submitted to the 1966 Federal Conference delegates foreshadowed the creation of the Schools Commission and the adoption of needs-based funding. When Whitlam at last replaced Arthur Calwell as opposition leader in 1967, I was asked whether I knew anybody who would be suitable to replace him, to replace Mathews, who was moving on, or would I take the job myself? What followed were by far the most fulfilling and tumultuous 5 years of my life. Well might it be said, a classic Whitlam formulation, that becoming Premier, Prime Minister, Secretary-General of the United Nations or Pope wouldn't, for me, hold a candle to it. As the poet Browning has it, bliss was it in that day to be alive, and to be young was the very heaven. Minutes after I installed myself in my new Parliament House office in Canberra, the door connecting it with Whitlam's suite suddenly burst open. Whitlam emerged, shouting for me to produce from Hansard, a publication with which then I had no more than a nodding acquaintance, the answer to a question on notice about the DFRB, an acronym of which I had never heard and which he did not explain. The shouting continued while I fumbled and failed to comply, and his face became redder and more purple until a tactful intervention by another staff member diffused the situation and he vanished again behind the door. Tiny by comparison with today's standards, his office comprised a staff of 6, 3 advisors and 3 secretaries. Graham Freudenberg, by Gough's account, my Sorensen, wrote the major speeches and advised on foreign policy and our broad political strategy. Peter Cullen, and on his departure Dick Hall, were our troubleshooters, maintaining the officers' party and trade union links and dealing with the interest groups which increasingly clamoured for Whitlam's attention. Nominally the principal private secretary or chief of staff, but in reality also the resident policy wonk, my immediate assignment was to reactivate and expand the domestic policy advice network that Mathews had established. I was to maintain the flow of information that enabled Whitlam to further refine the details of the policies whose broad nature in many instances was already clear in his mind, and draft his domestic policy speeches. It pained Whitlam that his staff had chosen mostly to educate themselves in unconventional ways, and were therefore, as he reminded us in moments of mock exasperation, educational dropouts. "Comrade," he once said to me, "you are 32, and what have you achieved? At 32, Alexander had conquered the world, and Jesus Christ had saved it." Approached by an embittered Arthur Calwell for having, quote, "an office full of long-haired academics," he responded that none of his staff were graduates and one of them was bald. He realised from the start that in order for policies to be accepted by the electorate, they had first to be understood. Medibank, later Medicare, for example, was explained constantly between 1968 and 1969, and again from 1969 until 1972, in Parliament and whenever platforms or media attention were attainable. He required that speeches that were prepared for him to be in part repetitive in order for their proposals to become as near universally understood as possible. Once a basic theme and content had been settled, drafts were exchanged repeatedly between him and whoever was doing the writing until he was satisfied that the best possible outcome had been achieved. Speeches such as the definitive political and constitutional problems in national transport planning, which he delivered in April 1968, could take weeks to complete. His memorable 1969 and 1972 election policy speeches were distillations of all the addresses that had preceded them, as far back as his entry to Parliament in 1952. Even so, the process was not necessarily immune to pitfalls, as the unveiling of what became Medibank at a lunchtime address in Sydney, at Sydney's Royal Prince Alfred Hospital exemplifies. Fogs at Canberra Airport have tormented politicians and public servants for years. I had stayed on in Parliament House the night before the speech was to be delivered in order to add some finishing touches and supervise the printing. Fog duly closed the airport the following morning and persisted in doing so until a little short of noon. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Whitlam had been ad-libbing for 20 or so minutes, and I was anything but popular. Insult was added to injury when doctors were overheard to comment afterwards on how much the better the speech had been before the prepared version of it had finally handed up to Whitlam. Malcolm Fraser mistakenly supposed that Australians would accept his abolition of Medibank in defiance of his 1975 undertaking to retain it because it had been in place for only 2 months prior to the notorious Remembrance Day coup. The real strength of Medibank stemmed at that point from the fact that it had been explained to the electorate more thoroughly than any other opposition proposal in our history. A relevant quintessential Fabian innovation was the creation of the great investigatory, reporting and recommendatory commissions, including the Schools Commission, the several post-secondary education commissions, and the Hospitals and Health Services Commission. Legislation for a Children's Commission that would have revolutionised early childhood development education and care was introduced but lapsed with the dismissal of the government in November 1975. Like the Ombudsman and the Auditor-General, the commissions were empowered to inquire into and report upon in all aspects of their respective briefs, directly to Parliament and the recommendations arising from them. Their outstanding work opened up government services to unprecedented level of scrutiny, facilitated forward planning and budgeting, and enabled informed and constructive public debate at unprecedented levels to occur. Their subsequent abolition at the hands of both coalition and the Labor governments has been a public policy and democratic enfranchisement setback of epic proportions. What then of the future? Let us turn finally to the party as accorded pride of place in the Whitlam mantra. As Santayana reminds us, those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. Control of the ALP conference and administration has once again, as in the 1960s, fallen into the hands of a small, unrepresentative and unaccountable clique of factional operators. Their so-called Stability Pact and patronage flowing from it enables them to ride roughshod over the wishes and concerns of rank-and-file members and divide up the spoils of office among themselves to the party's detriment. In question is whether necessary reforms and renewal of the party will thereby again and indefinitely be resisted and obstructed to the point where, as in the 1960s, its electability is impaired and its long-term viability imperilled? Will the current impasses be allowed to persist unchallenged, or will unaligned or factionally disaffected members in sufficient numbers back the reform cause through groups such as Local Labor and Open Labor? The well-being of the party cries out for our commitment to a reform agenda that is inclusive of the following: no ifs, no buts. Democratisation of the party through direct election of its governing bodies, enhanced role for local members in lower house pre-selections, plebiscites for upper house pre-selections to be mandatory, subversion of the secrecy of ballots for party and public office to be eliminated, and the authenticity and integrity of the process rigorously upheld and enforced. Strategic plans for more effectively gaining, retaining and involving members with agreed key performance indicators and regular reporting of outcomes to party conferences. Proper induction courses for new members, ongoing consciousness raising and skilling of members to ensure maximum engagement of their attributes and energies. Branches of new types to cater for diversity of member interests, identities and circumstances. Proper support of branches, such as through provision of speaker banks, discussion materials and access to resources including audio-visual equipment, desktop publishing and web-based communications including social media. Example and inspiration to be gained from, and I quote, campaigning unionism and the Your Rights at Work struggle as set out by Greg Combet, the best Prime Minister Labor never had, in his seminal memoir, The Fight of My Life. The union connection to be cherished, but with new safeguards against abuses of it. Democratisation of the selection of union delegates at party conferences. Factions on tap, but not on top. I conclude on a lighter note. Barry Cohen, elected to the House of Representatives on Whitlam's coattails in 1969, and a minister under Hawke, has a relevant story in his book, After the Party. It reads, I, Barry, had heard on the release of the massive tome, The Whitlam Government, 1972-1975, which I can't recommend too highly to you all, I had heard on the release of the massive tome, The Whitlam Government, 1972-75, Gough was asked by an intrepid young reporter whether this was the third major work on his period of government, the others being The Truth of the Matter by himself and A Certain Grandeur by Graham Freudenberg. He was reported to have replied loftily, yes, there was the crucifixion, the resurrection, and now we have the Gospels. I had tried to check the authenticity of this one. Barry, had tried to check the authenticity of this wonderful story with the man himself, but he was unable to do so as he was away overseas for a considerable period fulfilling UNESCO obligations. I eventually caught up with him and repeated the story. He paused for a moment before replying. I must say, I can't recall it, though it has a certain ring to it. However, I can tell you that I do keep the 3 books together on my office shelf. The 3 books, Barry inquired innocently. "Yes," he replied, "the Bible, the complete works of William Shakespeare, and the Whitlam government."
Well, thank you, Race, for some lovely recollections and for that great call to arms as well.